Hey everybody, it's Mr. Wagstaff. Cool stuff to talk about today. So, yesterday we started talking about the farmers and their political party with the populist party in the middle of the country. We're going to be talking about the farmers again today, but it gets a little bit more, people start getting a little angrier with each other. Now, they're angry over money, but when it starts coming down to food, like it is today, ooh, people get real angry. So that's what we're going to start talking about today. So let me go ahead and put myself up here in the corner. So farmers in the West, what you got to understand is that the farmers, as we talked about yesterday, have created their own political party, all right, called the Populist Party. So the Populist Party is the political party of the farmers, and the main thing the political party, the Populist Party, is going to do is fight to not go back onto the gold standard. We talked about that yesterday. The reason that's important is because the farmers are getting ready to make a union. All right. So the union is going to be called the Grange. And I'm getting ready to tell you the story about that here shortly. So while the same group of people, for the most part, are making up the Populist Party, as make up the Grange, which is the farmers' union, they do have different roles to play. All right. So let me start out by explaining to you what the problem is in the middle of the country. So tons and tons, I'm going to move myself down here a little bit. All right. Tons of people had moved out into the middle of the country. Hooray, great. And tons of people are making, are growing food. We'll say, for the sake of simplicity here, everybody's growing corn. Great. So everybody moves out there, Homestead Act, everybody's growing corn and they're selling it. Hooray. So we'll say one year, Billy, he grows he grows, I'll just make up random numbers here. Billy grows 10 acres of corn, right? Billy makes $5,000 off of selling that 10 acres of corn. Great money. Good. Well, he has 160 acres. If he wants to make more money the next year, what should Billy do? Well, if you're like me, you'd be like, Billy should just grow more corn. Yeah. So the next year, Billy grows 15 acres. Billy actually only makes $4,000 the next year. Oh my gosh, what is happening? So Billy starts panicking. He's like, how did I make less money? I need to work harder. So he starts growing more corn. But the more corn he grows and the more corn he sells, he's making less money because the price of corn keeps going down. And he is panicking because he wants to make more money. He's trying to survive. Now he about can't afford his farm anymore. Oh my gosh, what's happening? This is what's happening to all the farmers in the middle of the country. Because the farmers in the middle of the country don't understand supply and demand. So I want to explain to you what supply and demand is here. Now I do have my thinking cap. All right. But I think I can do this one without the thinking cap because it's pretty straightforward. All right. But if it gets too hard, always go back to the thinking cap. All right. So supply and demand. Here's why the farmers are about putting themselves out of business. All right. And this is bad. So they're all just individuals that are moving out here. So supply, which is this line right here, this is a graph. If you've taken economics before, you've probably seen a lot of these graphs. So supply, and this is price, all right? So the price goes up here and quantity goes out here. So as supply increases, all right? So as supply goes up, all right? So there's a higher quantity of it. The idea is that price should increase. Well, demand actually is going to gradually come down as supply goes up. Let me give you an example. And we'll just use corn and not date myself using modern technology. So when you're growing a whole bunch of corn and you only grow 10 acres of corn, well, there's a limited amount of corn. So supply is low, all right? So when supply is lower, all right, supply is down here. We'll say this is 10 acres of corn. All right. When supply is right here, all right, demand all right, is going to be way up here. All right. So demand is high. All right. So like 10 acres of corn here, and this is what deals with demand. So demand is right here. So that's great, because if demand is high, you can sell stuff for more money. All right. When you make too much of it, so you go to the grocery store, there's 2 ears of corn left and 5 people that want to buy it. How much can you sell that corn for? A ton. Because there is a low supply, less corn, and there's a high demand for it because people want to buy it. That increases prices. That's how you make money as a farmer. All right, supply and demand. All right, you got to keep your supply low so demand stays high. If 5 people show up at the grocery store and there's 6,000 bushels of corn, does it come in a bushel? I don't know. And there's 6,000 bushels of corn and the grocery store has to get rid of that, they'll sell it for next to nothing just to get rid of it. When that happens, it costs the farmer money to grow that corn, remember, and ship it and all that. All that lack of profit gets pushed back onto the farmer. So what's happening, all right? And you got big old fancy graphs here that I realize that may be confusing to you. So without having to get on the thinking helmet back on and going more into more graphs, let me clarify what's happening. The farmers, thinking they need to make more money by growing more corn, are actually increasing their supply of corn so much nobody wants to buy it, because it's just extra corn laying around everywhere. But they don't understand that, so they just keep trying to make more corn. The whole country's about to go out of business, or all the farmers about to go out of business, and then when they stop growing corn, everybody's going to starve to death because there is no supply. So what the farmers decide to do, and there's like one guy here with like a 6th grade education, he's like, hey, we'll call him Joey. He's like, here's how you fix it, all right? And here's a little thing here. We'll say, this is Joey. Joey's like, hey, here's what you got to do, all right? Because right next to him, this is Billy, right? That's Billy. So Joey, right here, he says, hey, Joey, next year, I know you're making 20 acres now and you're about to put yourself out of business. Next year, grow 8 acres. And Billy's like, again, this is Billy. He's like, what? No, if I only grow 8 acres, I won't make enough money. And Joey's like, yes, the laws of supply and demand say you will make more money if you grow less crops. Now, here's what the deal is. It can't just be Joey or Billy here, all right? You have to get all your people. I guess those are people over there. This is a horse. We'll pretend like that horse is a farmer too. Everybody has to agree to grow less corn, because collectively you have to bring down the amount of corn in the market. You have to bring down supply to drive up demand, make people really want it. Then you can charge whatever you want. The farmers realize they have to work together or they're going to put themselves out of business by working too hard. They create a union to manage this, all right? It is called the Grange. So the Grange, and is a farmers alliance, all right? So the Grange comes out, and what their goal is to basically tell everybody how much to grow so that everybody can make money. This is, I don't quite understand the picture. It's symbolic, but it is clearly a farmer sitting on a log, and it says the Granger, which is the main reason I wanted to put this visual up here for you. Farmers that were part of the Grange are called Grangers, and they collectively work together to make sure they don't produce too much to put themselves out of business. So the Grange is really important, and it is a farmers union where all the farmers have to learn to work together, and there's a certain amount that they're supposed to grow each year to maximize the profit. Really important here that the Grange lowers supply so that demand stays high enough that they can all make enough money to survive. So it's new to a lot of people, the farmers at the time, the fact that making more and working harder actually makes you less money. Because that's the complete opposite of what the American dream is. Like, work as hard as you can, gain more. At a certain point, you got to work smarter, not harder. Because so many people were growing food with the Homestead Act, it just flooded the market. So this is a picture of a Granger, a farmer in the Grange. I wanted to start today talking about the Grange and the creation of the Grange, because what you need to have in the back of your mind, because we're getting ready to talk about railroad corruption, and there's a ton of it. in the back of your mind, you need to remember that there is a farmers union in the middle of the country called the Grange, because we're going to come back to that here in a little bit. But let's talk about the railroad companies. Now, keep in mind, the railroad companies are not owned by the United States government, not even remotely at all in any way, shape, or form. The railroad companies are private industries. The government can ask them to do stuff, but they usually don't. Fully functioning, independent of the government. So they can do whatever the crap they want to do. There starts to become some issues with the railroads in the late 1800s. Mainly the fact that because they're their own private industry, but the entire country relies on them, that a lot of bad things can happen. All right? Because the entire country relies on the railroads for everything. It's how you get your raw materials. It's how you get heating and lighting for your house, however that comes. It's how you get your food. The whole country relies on these private industries. So if the private industries decides to be a jerk, there's nothing you can do about it because there's no government oversight. So we're getting ready to see some real issues with the railroad, who are putting their own personal interest over the interest of the country, all right? That could lead to catastrophic consequences that's going to force the government once again to move away from this laissez-faire, hands-off approach and actually get involved here with the railroad company. So we're going to talk about some corruption, some crazy little stories here that's happening with the railroad companies. I think you'll like it. All right. So there's this, let me start out with a picture of him. I'll go back to that. This is all George Pullman. Now, George Pullman, he's very rich. So there's actually this entire story. If I taught like the history of Illinois, this would be cool, but I don't. But so the whole city of Chicago was about to get flooded. They raised the entire city like 8 feet. That's a for real story. They jacked up, present day, the whole city of Chicago got raised like 8 feet. All right. George Pullman is one of the guys who came up with ways to jack up the city. If you're like, did they put a jack under the city and like jack? Yes, that's literally what they did. And George Pullman was a big part of that. All right. So George Pullman becomes wealthy from this. People know him. So what George Pullman decides to make, all right, are luxury railroad cars. I'm going to move myself over because there's a interesting bit about the servant here in this picture. So what, and this picture kind of encompasses all of George Pullman here. All right. So George Pullman isn't in this picture, but this is a railroad car. So these men are like on a railroad car, and they're called sleeper cars, where there's like bedrooms in these cars. There's fine dining. There's all types of, you get cigars and whiskey and like 5-star restaurant food. This is what George Pullman is going to make a ton of money off of, because what George Pullman does is he makes these fancy cars and then he rents them. He doesn't sell them. He rents them to railroad companies. All right. And if you're on this railroad car and you're just packed in the seat, but you want to go to the fancy Pullman car, right, which has a bedroom that you can sleep in, all this other stuff, you have to pay an additional fee to go back to that car. George Pullman also gets a cut of that money as well. So George Pullman makes these luxury railroad cars, and every train had to have one because everybody wants to know where the Pullman car is, because that's where you go eat and sleep and all that stuff if you pay the extra money. What's also interesting, so George Pullman ends up being a huge turd here at the end of the story, but he does some things that are unique at the time that I think he does deserve credit for, before we talk about how much of a turd he is. On the railroad cars, since he rents them, he technically owns them, he can decide who gets hired on them. He is willing to hire freed slaves and African Americans. This is a time when things are really segregated, and we're going to talk about that in the next lesson more so in detail. Extremely segregated. Most places wouldn't hire black people. All right. So granted, he is hiring them in a servant position. All right. But this is in the 1880s, 1890s. That is actually a step up from nobody hiring you for anything, as awful as that sounds. George Pullman ends up being the largest employer of African Americans in the United States because they work on these railroad cars. That should tell you how popular trains are, how popular his cars are, and how crazy wealthy he is the fact that he allows black people to work in these cars that he owns as servants. He becomes the single largest employer of African Americans in the United States. So that should give you an idea of how popular this is. In the background is a big window they're going by. This is his city. He creates a city. So what he does is he builds his own city because he's rich, where he is going to produce these cars at. And he has people come from all around into this city to work here. They make good money. It's a beautiful, everybody says it's beautiful. What's weird is when they work in these factories, these brutal practice. I mean, it's really tough work in the factories. That he may pay them $2 a day, but then also charge them $2 a day in rent to stay in the apartment that they are required to purchase from him or to rent from him, because he's like 50 miles from the next civilization. There's nothing else around. So at first they're like, hey, this is a great idea. And because this is the modern city that he makes. Well, he realizes these people can't leave unless he lets them leave, because the only way in or out is a train that he owns. So he can just abuse them once they show up to work in the city. And that's basically what he does. There ends up being an economic downturn in 1893, and a lot of people lose money. George Pullman, for whatever reason, thinks the best way of saving money is to cut everybody's salary. However, he doesn't lower rent. So now people can't even live at the places he's forcing them to live at in his own city. They get furious. They can't even afford a train ticket to leave. It gets absolutely furious. The whole country kind of looks at this and they're like, dude, people being upset is not uncommon. But here's where it gets crazy. These people are like starving. They're called starvation wages. These people are starving to death in his city. And the people in the city beg for a moderator, somebody from the government to come in and just sit down to prove that, look, we have legitimate concerns here. Well, that doesn't go well, because George Pullman, they talk about him, he's like a machine. He doesn't have like feelings everybody else does. It's kind of weird. He was like, no, I don't need to moderate anything because I've done nothing wrong. Absolutely not. Like, he refuses to even admit that he has done anything wrong, as his entire population that he has effectively like imprisoned here starts to starve to death. Now, I wish I could tell you they set everything on fire, steal his train, and beat him to death in the streets. They don't. He actually gets sick near the very end of this, and he's going to die like 2 years after this situation of natural causes. But the idea that this private man has like captured this city in the middle of nowhere and then just viciously crushed like their standard of living, and there's no way for them to leave. The city of Pullman and its collapse fundamentally makes people start questioning how much power does the railroad have when they can like entrap an entire town. So again, here's George Pullman. All right. So the next one that people start realizing that there's some shady stuff is the situation with Credit Mobilier. The company Credit Mobilier, it's pronounced Mobilier, but it's French, it's Mobilier. Credit Mobilier builds railroad tracks. That's their job. So this is a picture, I guess, the guy works for Credit Mobilier, and they're in the process of building railroad tracks. So the United States government realizes how valuable railroad tracks are and how important they are to people. So if the railroad company doesn't feel like building a track somewhere that the government wants them to, the government will actually pay to build railroad tracks so private companies can use it so it benefits society. All right. Credit Mobilier is the company that's just sitting here and like, yes, you would like us to build some railroad tracks for you. So what is happening? A lot of corruption after the Civil War is when railroad tracks need to be built and the government's going to pay for it, they will hire Credit Mobilier. They will pay Credit Mobilier 3 times the amount that it costs to build these railroad tracks. Like, they're just doing this almost in like broad daylight. Like, they're like, we're never going to get caught. So they pay them like 3 times the amount with taxpayer money. Credit Mobilier does go out and they do build the railroad line. They're who built the Transcontinental Railroad. But they're charging 3 times the amount. They build the railroads, they pocket a third of that, and then the other third, they turn around and they pay off everybody in Congress that gave them that money to begin with so that they get the money again. It is a huge scandal, all right? The New York Sun ends up figuring this out, and it's a newspaper that's at least 10 years ago still existed. The New York Sun found this out and basically calls them out on it, and everybody is shocked and horrified about how much government taxpayer money is being swindled by these private railroad companies. The railroad companies are paying nothing in return from having these railroad tracks, but they're getting all the benefit from it. All right. So you got the Pullman, these railroad companies seem to be like owning cities, and then you got the Credit Mobilier scandal where it looks like they're stealing money from the people, because they are. So understand that when it comes time for the Grange to stand up to the railroad company, people are already a little irritated at the railroad company. There's already been up with the Pullman situation, the Credit Mobilier situation. So the Grange, when they have a problem with the railroad company, kind of shocking to the railroad company, because they are like, that is the biggest industry in America at the time. That when people have a problem with the railroad company, people side with the farmers. And this actually shocks the railroad company. So let me tell you what happens. So this here, all these little red lines here, all right, these are all railroad tracks, all right? These are incredibly important. Now, these are all privately owned. Different railroad companies own it. Well, over in this area right here, I'll draw this a circle. Let me go with yellow should stand out here. Ooh, not really that much of it. But over here you have a whole bunch of homesteaders, all right? And we're going to talk specifically here about Illinois, all right? So in Illinois, there is a whole bunch of farmers. Again, we're going to say they're growing corn for simplicity's sake. They're growing all types of stuff, but we're going to say corn. In Illinois, when you grow a whole bunch of corn, there's nothing around here so you're growing thousands of acres, hundreds of thousands of acres across the state of corn. Well, there ain't that many people in Illinois that's going to eat that corn. All that food is going to go here. I really need to get another one other than yellow. We'll go blue. It goes all the way over here to the East Coast, more up there, all right, over me as well. That is where, well, gee willikers, don't be weird, all right? That is where all the food has to go to. Well, how do you get the food there? Keep in mind it's food. You can't put it on a horse and wagon because it'll take too long. Even though the Mississippi River, or is it right here, all right, you can't even sell the stuff down the Mississippi River and expect it to get out here on time, all right, and get to the East Coast. The only way to get it there before the food goes bad is by trains. The railroad companies know this, that the entire livelihood of the people in the middle of the country relies on the trains. So the trains, and they're really smart, they know all that corn has to get put on their trains and shipped to the other side of the country. So what the railroad companies do, they look at how much corn you're going to put on there. They know exactly how much it's going to sell for. They know exactly what the Grange is doing with supply and demand. They know exactly how much money that farmer's going to make. And they ask for 90% of it to ship it. And the farmer's like, what? I'm not paying that. They're like, fine, then don't ship your corn. And they're like, you can't do that. And they're like, we can, and we just did. So if you want to ship your corn and you want to get any money for it, you're going to give us like 90% of your profits. All right. The Grange comes together because all the farmers are furious. So they have a union. And the Grange comes together here in Illinois. This is where it starts at initially. And the Grange is going to call bullcrap on this. And they're like, absolutely not. We're not going to do that. So they go to court in Illinois. Now, keep in mind, everybody in Illinois here is farmers. That's an oversimplification, but they're all farmers. So the courts are very sympathetic to the farmers. And there's a court case called Munn v. Illinois, and this is crazy. All right. So this is a little picture here of like the the train, like the railroad company, that it is here, and it's just going to run all over the people, and they're just oblivious. And who's trying to save the people? So these are all the people who eat corn, and they're oblivious to the fact that the railroad company is getting ready to kill them. So who is trying to save the people? The Grange, the farmers union, is like, guys, if we don't stop the train, you're all going to die. All right? Like, you can't stop the train company. So this little cartoon here, there's a court case where the Grange sues the railroad. It's called Munn v. Illinois. All right? And they go to court and say, hey, we think the state of Illinois should be able to make the rates for the railroad company. And the railroad company's like, what? What are you talking? I'm a private company. Yeah, the state can't tell me what I can or can't charge. And then the state of Illinois shocks everybody. And they say, yeah, we can. Since you're shipping food and that keeps everybody alive, that's for the best interest of everybody. So from now on, the state of Illinois will decide how much you can charge when you ship something. Oh, the owners of the railroad company are furious. They're like, absolutely not. That is bullcrap. Absolutely not. And they actually take it to the Supreme Court. All right. So when they get to the Supreme Court, all right, and so these Granger laws, as they're called, laws that basically give all the power to the state to dictate it, when it makes it to the Supreme Court, here's what the Supreme Court decides. All right. They're like, oh, okay. So Illinois, we're not going to say Illinois has the right to dictate what the costs are everywhere. But if you're shipping it from one side of Illinois to the other, then yes, we are going to say that the state has a right to decide how much you can charge for shipping stuff. All right, if it's from one side to another. However, for interstate trade that goes from one state to another, the railroad companies will figure that out. So if you're trying to get food in North Carolina, which is where everybody wants it, like in any other state, anywhere on the East Coast you're trying to ship it to, anywhere, the railroad companies are going to, because this doesn't help at all. Because you're not trying to ship your corn from one side of Illinois to the other. You're trying to ship it to other parts. So once again, the railroad companies are back in charge for interstate trade, interstate trade, which means between multiple states. They jack up their prices again, and everybody is angry. Everybody's upset over this. Because once again, the railroad companies are, could possibly shut down the entire farming industry. This is when the United States government has had enough. And they're like, you know what? We're done. We're not going to do this anymore. So the United States government comes together. And they realize this whole hands-off affair, they could literally starve the country to death. Like the railroad companies could. They decided, you know what? We're not going to ship anything. We're not going to do it. It could shut down the entire country. And when it's food, that's a problem. So just like with the Pure Food and Drug Act that happened under Upton Sinclair's The Jungle when he came out with the muckrakers, and the federal government has to gradually get in control. Here's another example, and this is a big one. The federal government passes the Interstate Commerce Act, which will in turn create this thing called the Interstate Commerce Commission. The Interstate Commerce Commission is run by the federal government. But it employs, there's basically 5 people. So a farmer, railroad company, somebody from the state government, from the federal government. There's 5 people that get together. And they all have to agree on what these prices are. By doing this, they're going to let the railroad companies keep being wealthy because they don't want to stop the American dream. But they can't jack up their prices where it prevents people from getting food. So the Interstate Commerce Commission, created by the Interstate Commerce Act, is a very effective way, and this is still around today, and it monitors a lot of transfer trucks and stuff like that, stuff that's being shipped from state to state. So this is supposed to be, this is President Taft, we haven't talked about him yet, but he is supposed to, shipping interests, these are the farmers, railroad interests, these are the railroad companies that want to make as much money, this is supposed to be the government standing up and stopping both sides until you have to come to an agreement, so that they're just like two trains heading at each other, and it's bad things are going to happen. So once again, the federal government gets involved here with food or into private industry, at this point the railroad company, in order to do what's best for everybody else. So once again, you start seeing in the progressive era, the federal government stepping up their game ever so slightly, step by step, in order to do what's best for the people in the United States. All right, that's as far as we're going to get today. I will see you guys tomorrow.